Hello, listeners. This is Kat, and welcome back to Put Your Hands Up Podfix. This will be the continuation of Fellow Feeling. This will be Part 10, the second half to Chapter 8. Oh, Aizawa-sensei. Kacchan mentioned you might stop by. Caught off guard, Shouta can't help but stare. He isn't sure what he'd been expecting upon going to see Midoriya in the hospital, but it certainly hadn't been this. He looks good, is the thing. Not fully recovered. He's still pale, and he's a bit skinnier than normal, like he's lost muscle mass. But there's a touch of color back in his face, his eyes brighter and more focused than they'd been the last time he'd seen him. And though his smile is shaky, it's there. Now, though, Shouta knows what's lurking behind it. Midoriya has been moved into a new hospital room on a higher floor, where patients that are about to be discharged are kept. It's brighter up here. Large wall-length windows letting the sunlight into the room's every corner, and the rays light up a veritable mountain of gifts piled on the bedside table. Even though Class 1A hasn't been able to visit, their offerings have clearly made it to Midoriya regardless. It's ridiculous, quite frankly. Heaps of flowers in all stages of wilting, a hectic pile of chocolates and fresh fruit, a hill of stuffed animals all shapes and sizes. One sitting on the very top of the pile, in a particularly flashy All Might plushie wearing one of his more obscure costumes. A note in the plushie's lap reads, "Feel better soon, young Midoriya." Shouta holds back an indignant snort. All Might had bought his own merch as a gift? Typical. Midoriya himself is sitting in a chair by the window, dressed in what looks like a fresh set of clothing from home. They're loose-fitting, and with the way his shirt is bunched up over his sides, Shouta can see the very edge of a raised scar. Midoriya goes a bit pink when he realizes where he's looking, though, and quickly smooths the shirt back down. Oh, don't mind that, he says with an anxious laugh. There's a little bit of scarring, but it's not that bad. It had looked bad, but Shouta has no desire to press him. Midoriya fidgets, anxiety written into his every curve, and Shouta realizes quickly that he probably looks very strange, standing here without saying anything. He needs to break the tension. He forces himself to smile, though his heart feels heavy. Looking at Midoriya now, all he can see is a young 4-year-old version of his scruffy hair and bright eyes, wilting like a plucked rose under his father's abuse. His eyes dart to the place where his collar dips to its lowest point, and he imagines that he sees a fierce ring of bruising there, so dark and mottled that it looks like it'll never fade. You slept for a long time, Shouta tries, taking slow, deliberate steps until he reaches the chair opposite Midoriya, and sinks down into it. He doesn't want to make himself seem like a threat, especially now. But Midoriya just cringes. I know, I'm really sorry, Aizawa-sensei. I didn't mean to sleep for 2 weeks. Are you here to bring me my schoolwork? His schoolwork. Midoriya had nearly died, has only been awake for 3 days, and he's already thinking about schoolwork. Has Shouta really made himself out to be as cruel as this? Don't worry about your schoolwork, he says, which makes Midoriya frown. You've been excused from your missing assignments, so you should focus on recovering. Oh, he blinks like he's really surprised that Shouta isn't trying to force him to do the work he'd missed while he was in a coma. Then, why are you here? It's such a strange question. Midoriya had nearly died, and he doesn't understand why he's come to see him. Of course he's here to make sure he's okay. He would have shown up for any of his students in this situation. Tragic backstory or not, he owes it to all of his students to be there for them when they suffer something as devastating as what had happened down in those tunnels. I came here to make sure you were okay, he says like it's obvious, because it should be. I was worried. Really? Midoriya shoots him a quizzical look. Of course. Midoriya, what you went through in the tunnels was brutal. Doesn't it make sense that I'd want to check on you? Huh. Yeah, I guess so. He gives a sheepish shrug, admitting. I'm sorry, but I don't remember most of it, so it doesn't feel like a big deal to me. Not a big deal. I mean, I remember some things, he amends, no doubt picking up on the horror on Shouta's face and mistaking its cause. I remember a really horrible pain in my side, and then this awful wave of fear. I think Kacchan was trying to keep me awake, but it was just so hard to focus, but that's it, really. You don't remember fighting the villain before the building collapsed? A nervous smile. Not a thing, sorry. There's no way. There's no way that's all he remembers. Sure, Bakugo had suffered a bit of memory loss, but that had only been at the very height of his drugged, injured attempt to fight the villain. Even if Midoriya can't remember certain chunks of the patrol, there is no reason he should have forgotten everything. And besides, if he was showing signs of amnesia, he's pretty sure the hospital wouldn't be so keen to release him only days after awakening. Shouta studies his face, and he finds the confirmation he's looking for. There are these small, tense lines around the corners of his eyes and the curve of his lips, like he's trying to hold something back. Like he's trying to make Shouta think that he's okay, so he'll leave him alone as soon as possible. And really, doesn't it make sense? Midoriya has just been through something traumatic, something that no doubt dug up the past that he'd tried so hard to shove down. Being around Bakugo had been bad enough in and of itself, but the villain's venom had kicked his fears into overdrive. Shouta knows that he'd relived that horrible night down in those tunnels, knows because Midoriya had looked at him with those wide, terrified eyes and whispered, "Dad?" Midoriya doesn't want to admit it. He doesn't want to acknowledge what had happened, the fact that this event had left him deeply, deeply shaken, and it's easier to pretend that he's forgotten. In the back of his mind, Bakugo's voice whispers, "When he needs help, he won't accept it unless it's forced upon him." "Midoriya," he says, which prompts a cringe. "I already know." There's a pause, just long enough to be suspicious. Then, with a strained smile, "I'm not sure what you're referring to, Aizawa-sensei." "Bakugo already told me. You don't have to pretend." His smile grows even thinner. "I'm really not getting your meaning." "Midoriya, I'm not going to think any less of you for being afraid. I know it must be difficult to talk about, but lying about it isn't going to help you in the long term. Bakugo already told me about what happened when you were children, and I know that you experienced at least one flashback when you were dosed with that villain's venom. I understand that you don't want to think about it, but considering the circumstances, I at least wanted to—" "Aizawa-sensei." It's said so quietly, so calmly that it stops him in his tracks. Midoriya is just sitting there, leaned against the back of his chair, his hands limp in his lap. And though he looks relaxed, based on the gentle slouch of his spine and the droop of his shoulders, his expression gives away his dread. His eyes are burning. "What did Kachan tell you?" "He told me about what happened on his 5th birthday, the night when—" "I know what night, Aizawa-sensei." He stops. Midoriya's fingers have curled subtly, under his palms, not quite fists, but close. He's shaking very slightly, like he's trying to contain it without much success. "You can't prove it," Midoriya whispers, his voice tight. "I didn't have a flashback." "You called me Dad, Midoriya. You were terrified." Midoriya chews his lower lip. Shouta lets him stew for a second, knowing that he has to be exceedingly careful here not to push him back into himself, and it's a stupid comparison, but he can't help but be reminded of when he'd first found Bastard curled behind a dumpster, ragged and spitting, and it had taken a week of gentle coaxing before he'd managed to lay so much as a finger on the poor cat. He'd been hurt by so many people that he hadn't wanted to trust anyone, and if Shouta hadn't taken things slowly, giving him time to adjust, he would have ran away and never returned. This is something like that, he thinks. Midoriya is curled behind a tall, tall wall, one that he's been building since he was 4 years old, and getting him out from behind it isn't going to be as easy as tossing bits of food to a feral cat. "I know how traumatic that experience must have been for you," he starts, but Midoriya is shaking his head furiously before he gets any further than that. "No," he says. "No." "And because I understand how difficult it is to open up about these kinds of things, I'm not going to force you to talk to me about the details, but—" "I said no, Aizawa-sensei. I have no idea what you're talking about. I don't have trauma." "But," he repeats patiently, "I think it's important that we address the fact that you're scared of me." Midoriya stops, dead in his tracks. A breath spills into the stale hospital air, sharp and choking. Whatever aura of calmness he'd been trying to project, it slips and shatters. I'm not," he protests, though it's hardly convincing. "Aizawa-sensei, I'm sorry if I did anything that made you think—" Shouta reaches out an arm, keeping his movement slow and obvious, and places his hand on Midoriya's knee. He stops. "Midoriya, I already know." There's a beat. Midoriya stares at him, expression frozen between shock and denial. His eyes find the place where Shota's hand meets the cloth of his pants, tracing his arm up to his shoulder, then from his shoulder to his face, and he stares at him like a deer in the headlights. Something cracks behind those eyes, a chink in the armor of his facade. And just like that, it all comes crashing down. Midoriya goes white as a ghost. His eyes suddenly seem almost sunken, the bags beneath them dark and mottled, and he gives a miserable whine as he hunches over, hand swinging to cover his mouth as if in an attempt to keep himself from vomiting. The pretense of normalcy he'd been so desperately maintaining cracks down the middle, and for the first time, Shouta gets a good look at the child beneath the veneer. And he's small. Distantly, Shouta remembers how Bakugou had described Midoriya all the way back then, when they weren't even 5 years old. "An inch shorter than everyone else our age," he'd said, and all of a sudden Shouta doesn't think he'd meant in height alone. Midoriya looks like he's fought a lengthy battle with the world and lost, like he's been trying to climb out of the pits his father had thrown him in for years, since he was 4 years old, but something has always hooked itself in his shoes and dragged him back down screaming into the abyss. Like he'd stared the cruel reality of life right in the face, has watched his childhood friend implode on himself, has watched his mother wither under his father's abuse, and has forced himself not to blink. Like he's continued moving forward, wading through quicksand while his classmates flew above him, and he's sunk so far down that escape seems impossible. Every time he tries to move, he's sucked further in. But despite that, he has never once asked for help. Well, Shouta is done waiting for him to ask. "It has always been my policy," he says, "that I would lay down my life for my students if the necessity ever arose, that above all else, I would value your safety and act to protect you even at the height of a crisis. When I put myself between your class and the villains at the USJ, I did so for that reason, and that reason alone. Back then, did you doubt that I would give my life to defend you?" Midoriya says nothing for a long moment. He just shakes his head, squeezing his eyes shut, as if that will stop the tears from dripping silently down his face. Until finally, painfully, "No, Aizawa-sensei, I didn't." "And at the training camp, was there ever a moment you suspected that I would turn on you, or refuse to help you if you needed it?" "No." "Are you telling me the truth?" A pause. "Yes." "Midoriya." "That is the truth." Shouta stops. Across from him, Midoriya shakes, nails biting into his knees in a failed attempt to ground himself, like if he relaxes his hold even a fraction he'll float away. Midoriya gives a dry swallow, keeping his eyes determinedly fixed on his hands. "I didn't doubt you," he whispers. Then when Shouta starts to rebuke him, "I didn't. Logically, I knew that you would protect me, but this voice in the back of my mind kept telling me." He sucks in a harsh breath and can't seem to continue. His eyes glaze over like he's trying to slip away, but Shouta refuses to let that happen. Keeping a grounding hand on his knee, he asks, "What did it tell you?" "Just the first time you saw me, you said I'd be useless. A liability. And that's what I was to Kachan, right? I was weak, and he got hurt trying to protect me, and he hated me for it. And I remember I remembered him saying to me once that I was useless too, and he was right. You were both right." It's like being doused in cold water, because he'd already known that Midoriya had made a connection between him and his father, but hearing evidence of that connection spoken aloud is nothing short of eviscerating. "I know you didn't mean it like that," Midoriya says, his voice muffled as he presses a hand to his face. "You were trying to give me advice on becoming a hero. You didn't mean that I was a useless person. But I'd already failed to save Kachan once, and when I heard you say that, He gives a miserable, tense shrug. "I don't know." But Shouta knows. He can see it written all over Midoriya's face. Midoriya had heard that one singular comment about his usefulness, and that had been it. In that moment, his brain had made the switch, pulled his teacher out and slotted the vague ghost of his father in his place, and in his mind, there had been no separating them. It's not rational, but trauma isn't always rational, and Midoriya had known that, had fought it, even trying to convince himself that he was wrong, that Shouta wasn't the same type of person as his father. But he'd never been able to shake the impression that that first meeting had left him with. And it's horrifying, Shouta thinks, to know that he'd lost Midoriya within moments of meeting him, all because he'd assumed he knew him based on that singular clip from the entrance exam. It's not just you, Midoriya goes on, quiet. I mean, I'm not even afraid of you, if that makes sense. It's just, my brain doesn't work right sometimes. One little trigger and all I can think about is at night. I mean, I understand that no one is going to hurt me, least of all you. But sometimes someone moves too fast, or gestures too wildly, or speaks too loudly, and I just... Midoriya. Yes? You have PTSD. Silence. Then quietly. Oh. Such a small word to encapsulate such a desperate situation. Midoriya had been suffering since he was 4 years old, and no one has ever noticed. And the only thing he can say about it is, oh. Shouta takes a deep, slow breath, lets it out, prepares himself to deal with a situation that should have been dealt with years ago. It's okay, he says, because he can tell that Midoriya is spiraling. Most heroes deal with it at one point or another. It's part of the job. No one will judge you for it. But Midoriya just looks at him, lost, and says, I thought PTSD was for heroes who fought in really awful battles. This kid. You did fight in an awful battle, he says, like talking to a child. You went up against a terrible, cruel man, and you won. But just because you won doesn't mean that you didn't experience the trauma of it too. There's no gatekeeper for mental health, Midoriya. It's like watching a key turn in a lock. Midoriya looks at him, and his eyes widen very slightly. Shouta says, I can't imagine the horror of that night, and I'll never ask you to relive it. But you have to understand that the way things are right now, it's dangerous for both yourself and others. If your PTSD is triggered in the middle of a fight, or while you're saving a civilian, Midoriya, people could die. Those people could be your classmates, your friends, anyone, and that's not okay. It earns him a wince. No, Midoriya agrees in a whisper, which is a big accomplishment in and of itself. It's not. So, if you're okay with it, I want you to talk to someone when you come back to UA. He can practically feel Midoriya's guard slam up, a ghost of how Bakugou had responded to that same request, and really, why wouldn't he react this way? He spent his whole life trying to avoid making people worry about him, trying to hide the firestorm raging beneath his skin. The prospect of talking to someone must be terrifying. Who? Midoriya demands, suspicious. The school employs full-time counselors. Bakugou started his appointments last week. I'd like you to follow his example. That makes Midoriya pause. Kachan? He asks wondrously. Kachan agreed to go to therapy? He's already been several times, Shouta confirms, and watches as Midoriya considers that, chewing on the idea of his explosive classmate being willing to talk to someone about his feelings. It seems to have done him some good, too. Really? Really. You should have seen him after his appointment yesterday. He was downright peachy. Midoriya stares at him awed, but then he sobers some of his astonishment, fading back into suspicion as he asks, Is Kachan angry at me? Interesting. Shouta knows that Bakugou had visited Midoriya just yesterday, but whatever conversation had taken place between them, it must not have left Midoriya reassured that Bakugou doesn't hate him for what had happened in the tunnels. And, well, there's a lot Shouta wants to say to that. He wants to tell Midoriya that Bakugou has never hated him, that rather, it's beginning to seem like quite the opposite. He wants to tell him that Bakugou hates himself, even, for what he believes to be his failure to keep Midoriya safe. He wants to tell him that despite the impossible tangle of emotions that exists between them, there's still hope for them, because Bakugou still cares, and Midoriya does too. But Shouta has meddled enough already, without stumbling through a ham-fisted attempt at trying to play the middleman between two traumatized teenagers. This is something that they need to work through among themselves, with the help of their counselors, without someone interfering who doesn't understand what had happened that night. Because in the end, Midoriya and Bakugou are the only two people who will ever understand. Shouta has done enough. The rest will be up to them. You should ask him yourself, he says. This time, I think he'll answer honestly. Midoriya blinks at him, puzzled. This time, he echoes like he can't quite figure it out. Wait, you really think he'll talk to me? I have no doubt that he will. Because Midoriya hadn't been awake, but Shouta had. He'd seen the way Bakugou had clung to him, snapping and growling at anyone who dared to get too close. He'd seen the way Bakugou had tried to die for him, placing himself in front of the villain's claws and a ghost of this encounter with Midoriya's father years ago. He'd heard Bakugou's desperate words. I didn't hate him. I hated myself. And he'd recognized the truth behind them. Bakugou is ready. He's sure of it. So even if it's not easy, he has faith in his students. I'll set up an appointment for you. Shouta promises just as he'd promised Bakugou a week ago. I'm not going to lie. It won't be easy. But if you're determined enough, you'll be okay. Both you and Bakugou. There's this moment where the world stands still, where Midoriya looks at him, expression crinkled with the pain of an event that had taken place over the course of just a few minutes, over a decade ago. But that sticks to his bones to this day. He trembles like he's dying, his eyes going shiny and dark, and that's it. He sobs. It's loud and messy and horrible, tears rolling down his cheeks in waves, eyes squeezed shut and puffy, these desperate, bone-deep gasps choking their way up his throat. He sounds like he's dying. His breaths are sharp and ragged, like they're cutting the inside of his throat on the way out, and even though he buries his face in his hands in an attempt to muffle the noise, every gasp is painfully loud. But Shouta doesn't say a word about it. This is the product of over a decade of silence, of fake smiles and silent agony. And Midoriya needs it, needs to feel like it's okay to not be okay, needs to feel like someone will listen to him, care about him, without any strings attached. Shouta's hand is still on Midoriya's knee, and he sits there silently, waiting until he feels a set of cold fingers curl around his wrist. Midoriya's grasp tightens, giving the slightest tug like he isn't sure he's allowed, and even though Shouta has never been a particularly physical person, he allows it because this, too, is something that Midoriya needs. He leans across the gap, the armrest sticking painfully into his ribs, and pulls Midoriya into a hug. It's going to be okay, he whispers as Midoriya's fingers curl miserably into the back of his sweater, face pressed to his chest. You'll be okay, Midoriya. And for the first time since he'd met Midoriya, had watched him shoot into the sky and pass the entrance exam with a single blow, had watched him throw that rubber ball and smile at him, shaking. He knows it's true. All right, listeners, this concludes Chapter 8 of Fellow Feeling. The last and final chapter will be up next, Chapter 9. I hope you all are still enjoying this fic. Let me know your thoughts and reactions to this so far. And as always, thank you so much for listening.